You wake up in the morning and look in the mirror. For a second, before your mind starts listing everything you need to do, who you need to be, what role you need to play today, there's a pause, and in that pause, you feel something strange, almost frightening. It's a silent question knocking at the door of your consciousness. Who is this person in the mirror? Because you know there's a version of you that others expect, that your job demands, that your family needs, that society approves of. You dress yourself in this persona every day. Adjust the mask, repeat the right lines, smile at the appropriate moments. And on the outside, everything seems to work. But inside there's a scream you suffocate every morning. A scream that says, this isn't me. This life I'm living, these choices I'm making, this path I'm following, it's not mine, it belongs to someone else. And the worst part isn't even living the wrong life. The worst part is knowing it and continuing to pretend everything's fine. It's waking up every day and choosing the lie, because the truth seems too big, too dangerous, too impossible. You feel trapped in a cage you built yourself, and the key is in your hand the whole time. But you're so afraid to open the door that you prefer to pretend the key doesn't exist. If you recognized yourself in this pain, in this sensation of living a borrowed life, then you need to know about a man who dedicated his entire existence to answering a single question: how do we become who we really are when we're condemned to be free? This man is Jean-Paul Sartre, and his philosophy won't give you comfortable answers or magic formulas, but it will do something much more valuable. It will rip the blindfold from your eyes and show you that the prison you're in only exists because you choose every second to remain in it, and that the frightening freedom you feel when you think about being yourself isn't a burden. It's the only thing that no one ever can take from you. In a modest apartment in the 16th district of Paris, in June 1905, a frail baby is born who seems destined for anonymity. Jean-Paul Charles Ahmad Sartre arrives in the world without much ceremony, son of Jean-Baptiste Sartre, a naval officer who will die when the boy is only 15 months old, leaving behind a young widow and an orphan who will grow up without a father figure, a void that will profoundly mark the way he understands human existence. Sartre's mother, Anne-Marie Schweitzer, returns to her parents' house, and there, under the roof of Charles Schweitzer, an authoritarian and intellectual professor, little Jean-Paul will grow up among books, academic expectations, and a permanent sense of being an intruder, of occupying a space that isn't completely his. Charles Schweitzer, uncle of the famous Albert Schweitzer, imposes on his grandson a rigorous education filled with classical literature, and the boy, ugly by conventional standards, short, with a pronounced strabismus that makes him seem always to be looking at a place no one else can see, finds in books a refuge and a way of existing that physical reality denies him. He reads voraciously, writes his first stories with a seriousness almost comical for his age, and begins to construct an identity that doesn't depend on the body he inhabits, but on the words he can manipulate. It's in this solitary and literary childhood that Sartre develops an acute awareness that existence precedes any essence, that we aren't born with a defined purpose, but are thrown into the world and need to create our own meaning amid the chaos. He perceives, even as a boy, that the people around him live roles, play characters that society wrote for them, and that there's a brutal difference between who we are and who we pretend to be. This perception, this open wound of not fitting in anywhere, not being beautiful enough, strong enough, normal enough, is what gives birth to the philosopher he will become. When Sartre enters the École Normale Supérieure in Ijoisse, one of France's most prestigious academic institutions, he finds a bubbling, intellectual environment where the ideas of Kant, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger circulate intensely among young people who believe that philosophy isn't just an abstract exercise, but a tool to transform reality. It's in this cauldron of debates and intellectual passions that Sartre meets Simone de Beauvoir in 1929. During studies for the agrégation, the rigorous exam that certifies teachers in France. Beauvoir is the most brilliant woman he's ever met, and the encounter between the two is like a spark that ignites a fire that will never go out. They don't build a conventional relationship. They refuse marriage, reject obligatory monogamy, create a pact of freedom where both are transparent about other loves, other passions, but maintain an intellectual and emotional complicity that will last until Sartre's death. They call themselves necessary love, in contrast to the contingent loves they can have with other people. And in this radical relationship for the standards of the time, Sartre and Beauvoir live in practice the philosophy he's beginning to formulate, that we're free to create our own rules, that we don't need to accept the social scripts imposed on us, that authenticity requires the courage to live according to our own truths, even when the whole world judges us for it. In the 1930s, Sartre begins teaching at various lycees throughout the French countryside, living an apparently common life as a philosophy teacher, but inside he's in intellectual ferment. He discovers Husserl's phenomenology and becomes fascinated by the idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something, that there's no interior self isolated from the world, but an intentionality that constantly throws us outside ourselves toward objects, people, situations. Sartre travels to Berlin in 1933 to study phenomenology more deeply, and it's there that he dives into Heidegger's works, especially Being and Time, which completely revolutionizes his way of thinking. Heidegger speaks of a fundamental anguish before existence, of how human beings live most of the time inauthentically, lost in what he calls das Man, the impersonal, the mode of existing in which we simply follow what everyone does without ever questioning, without ever taking responsibility for our choices. And Sartre, reading this, recognizes what he's seen since childhood, that most people are asleep, living on autopilot, repeating patterns they never consciously chose. But unlike Heidegger, who sees an opening to being through an almost mystical relationship with existence, Sartre takes things to much more radical and desperate territory. For him, there's no hidden essence waiting to be discovered, no true self you need to find. You have no human nature, you have no destiny written in the stars. You're nothing more than what you do. Existence precedes essence, and this means you're radically free and radically responsible for who you become. In 1938, Sartre publishes his first novel, Nausea, and this book isn't just a work of fiction, but a visceral philosophical experience that places the reader inside the consciousness of Antoine Roquentin, a man who experiences an overwhelming existential crisis upon perceiving the absolute contingency of all things. Roquentin looks at a tree root in the park of Berville and suddenly is seized by a metaphysical nausea, a horrible perception that things simply exist, without reason, without purpose, without justification. The tree is there, absurd, contingent, and could perfectly well not be. You're here, absurd, contingent, and could perfectly well not be. There's no necessity that sustains existence, no divine plan, no cosmic order. Everything is gratuitous, everything is too much. And this perception, instead of being liberating, is nauseating, because it pulls the ground out from under our feet, leaves us without excuses, without crutches, without anything to hold on to. Nausea is a disturbing book, because it touches on something we all feel in moments of frightening lucidity. The sensation that none of this makes sense, that we're all improvising, pretending there's a script when actually we're completely lost in an indifferent universe. And Sartre offers no consolation. He doesn't say everything will be okay. He says, yes, you're right, it's exactly like that. Now what are you going to do about it? When World War II explodes in September 1939, Sartre is drafted into the French army and assigned to a meteorological post near the Maginot Line, where his function is to launch meteorological observation balloons. A task so absurd and useless, it seems like a perfect metaphor for the human condition he describes in his texts. But in June 1940, when Nazi Germany invades France with brutal speed and France capitulates in a matter of weeks, Sartre is captured and spends 9 months in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. It's there, behind barbed wire fences, living with other French soldiers, writing plays to entertain the prisoners and keeping secret philosophical diaries, that something changes profoundly in Sartre. He realizes that freedom isn't just an individual matter, but a political and social question, that you can be physically imprisoned, but the most dangerous prison is the one that happens when you renounce your interior freedom. When you resign from making choices, when you hide behind excuses like destiny, human nature, circumstances. Sartre manages to be released in March 1941 using a false medical certificate, claiming vision problems due to his strabismus, and returns to occupied Paris, a ghost city where Nazi soldiers patrol the avenues, where curfews silence the nights, where Jews are forced to wear yellow stars, and where fear settles in as a permanent resident on every corner. And it's in this Paris suffocated by occupation that Sartre writes his most important and monumental philosophical work, Being and Nothingness. Being and Nothingness, published in 1943, in the middle of the Nazi occupation, is a book of more than 700 pages that functions as a grandiose and ambitious attempt to construct a phenomenological ontology, a complete theory about what it means to exist as human consciousness in a world of things. Sartre divides reality into 2 fundamentally different regions, being in itself, which is the mode of existing of objects, of things that simply are what they are, complete, closed, without consciousness, like a stone or a table, and being for itself, which is the mode of existing of human consciousness, which is never what it is, which is always projecting itself toward the future, choosing, negating, creating possibilities. For itself is characterized by lack, by nothingness, by the capacity to annihilate, to introduce non-being into being. When you look at a chair and think it could be different, when you look at your life and imagine how it could have been, you're introducing nothingness, possibility, negation. And it's exactly this capacity to negate what exists and imagine what doesn't exist that constitutes human freedom. You're not a finished thing, you're a perpetual process of choice, and you can't escape this even for a second, even when you choose not to choose, when you decide to follow the herd. When you pretend circumstances decide for you, you're choosing, And Sartre calls this attempt to escape freedom bad faith, a central concept in his philosophy that describes the lie we tell ourselves when we pretend we're not free, when we hide behind social roles, fixed identities, excuses that allow us not to take responsibility for our lives. Before continuing, I want to pause here and speak directly with you. How many times have you felt that you are living a life that isn't really yours, that you're just following a script that other people wrote for you, and inside there's a silent scream asking to be who you really are? I know it hurts to admit this, because it feels like you're failing, that you should be grateful for what you have, that it's selfish to want more. But I want you to know something. This feeling doesn't mean you're ungrateful or weak. It means you're alive, conscious, and there's a truth inside you asking to come out. And I'm certain it's not just you who feels this. Go to the comments now and write this: I'm living someone else's life. It may seem simple, but when you put it into words, something changes, and you know what happens. Another person watching this video, feeling completely alone with this weight, will read your comment and realize they're not alone. Your comment might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. So go ahead, without fear, without shame. We're here together in this search. Bad faith is one of the most powerful and disturbing concepts Sartre develops, because it shows us how we're masters at deceiving ourselves. Think about the cafe waiter Sartre describes in being a nothingness. He moves in an exaggerated, theatrical way. His hands make very precise, very rehearsed gestures. He bows in a manner that's almost a caricature of what a waiter should be. And Sartre asks, why does he do this? Because he's trying to be a waiter. He's trying to coincide perfectly with the essence of waiter. As if he were a thing, as if his identity as waiter were fixed and determined. But the problem is, he's not a waiter in the same way a stone is a stone. He's playing the game of being a waiter, and in this game, he hides from his freedom, from his capacity to choose to be something else, to quit his job, to change his life, to be whoever he wants. And it's not just the waiter. It's you when you say you can't do something because that's not your way. When you say you act a certain way because you were born that way. When you define yourself by rigid categories and use these categories as an excuse not to change, not to grow, not to take the terrifying risk of reinventing yourself. Bad faith is when you treat yourself as a thing, as a determined object, instead of recognizing you're a free subject, always in process, always capable of choosing again at every instant. And Sartre isn't judging. He understands why we do this, because absolute freedom is terrifying. It means you have no excuses, you have nothing to blame, you have no nature that justifies your failures. You're totally responsible for who you are. And this responsibility can seem like an unbearable weight. But Sartre doesn't stop there. He shows that our existence doesn't happen in a vacuum, but always in situation, always in relation to others. And this is where one of the most impactful concepts of his philosophy enters, the look of the other. You're walking down the street, immersed in your thoughts, living the world from your perspective, and suddenly you feel someone is looking at you. In that second, something changes radically. You stop being pure subject and also become object. You become a thing seen, judged, categorized by the consciousness of the other. And this creates a situation of fundamental conflict. The other steals my freedom by transforming me into an object under their gaze, by defining me in ways I don't control. When someone looks at you and thinks you're shy, you're beautiful, you're boring, you're strange. That person is creating a version of you that exists in their consciousness, and you don't have direct access to that version, can't control it, can't change it easily. And worse, you begin to internalize these gazes, begin to see yourself through others' eyes, begin to construct your identity based on how others see you. That's why Sartre writes in his play No Exit that famous and brutal line, "Hell is other people." Not because people are necessarily evil, but because the other's gaze transforms me into a thing, freezes me in an identity, takes away the fluidity of my freedom. And at the same time, I need the other. I desire to be recognized by the other. I want the other to see me in a specific way. It's a game of love and war, of seduction and conflict, where each consciousness tries to affirm its freedom while dealing with the threatening freedom of the other. And if you're beginning to question your own choices and the freedom you carry, leave your like on this video so more people can discover Sartre's thought. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos about the philosophers who changed our way of seeing the world. When the war ends in 1945 and Paris is liberated, Sartre is already a well-known public figure, and in the post-war years, he becomes probably the most influential intellectual in France, perhaps in Europe. Existentialism becomes fashionable. The cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, especially Café de Flore and Les du Magos, become the epicenter of philosophical debates where young artists, writers, and students discuss existential anguish, freedom, and authenticity while drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. Sartre and Beauvoir are the kings of this intellectual scene. Charismatic figures who live what they preach, rejecting bourgeois conventions, living modestly, despite fame, dedicating their lives to writing, to thinking, to political engagement. But Sartre realizes existentialism is being misunderstood. People think that if existence has no meaning and we're radically free, then nothing matters, we can do whatever we want, everything is permitted, and he needs to clarify this confusion. In 1945, Sartre publishes Existentialism is a Humanism, a lecture he gave in Paris to an overflowing audience where he explains that existentialism isn't a desperate nihilism, but a philosophy of radical responsibility. Yes, we're free. Yes, we create our own values, but this doesn't mean anything goes. It means that in choosing, I choose not only for myself, but I create an image of the human being. I'm saying what kind of world I want to live in. When I choose to be honest, I'm affirming that honesty is a value. I'm creating a world where honesty matters. When I choose to be cowardly, I'm creating a world where cowardice is acceptable. And this is a crushing responsibility, because it means every choice I make has immense moral weight. Not because there's a God judging, not because there's a natural law, but because I'm responsible for giving shape to humanity through my choices. It's in this post-war period that Sartre intensifies his political engagement. He was always leftist, always believed the philosopher can't stay in an ivory tower observing the world from afar, but needs to get their hands dirty, needs to engage in the concrete struggles of their time. Sartre draws increasingly closer to Marxism, although he always maintains a critical and problematic relationship with it. He tries to make a synthesis between existentialism and Marxism, arguing that Marxism is right about the importance of material conditions, about how economic structure shapes people's lives, but is wrong to reduce human beings to products determined by circumstances. For Sartre, Even within the worst conditions, even under the most brutal oppression, the human being maintains a residue of freedom, a capacity to choose how to respond to the situation, how to give meaning to what happens to them. He becomes deeply involved in decolonization issues, especially in the Algerian War, where he supports Algerian independence against French domination, a position that earns him threats, attacks from far-right groups, and the anger of many French people who see his patriotism as betrayal. But Sartre doesn't back down. For him, freedom can't be only for some, can't be a privilege of rich and powerful countries, while millions of people in the Third World live under colonial domination. Either freedom is universal, or it's nothing. In 1960, Sartre publishes Critique of Dialectical Reason, a dense and difficult book where he tries to develop an existentialist Marxist theory of history and collective praxis. He's obsessed with a question: how is collective action possible if each individual is radically free? How do groups, social classes, revolutionary movements form if each person is, fundamentally, alone in their freedom? Sartre develops concepts like seriality, where people are reduced to isolated atoms by the capitalist system, like someone waiting in a bus line, each concerned only with themselves, without real solidarity and the group infusion, where in revolutionary moments people unite in a common project, overcome their seriality, and create something greater than the sum of individuals. It's an ambitious attempt to think about history and politics from individual freedom. But the book is extremely complex, almost unreadable in parts, and never achieves the impact of Being and Nothingness or his literary works. But it shows Sartre's intellectual honesty, his refusal to stay comfortable in one position, his constant need to rethink, to question, to take ideas to their ultimate consequences, even when this means entering obscure and contradictory territories. In 1964, something happens that shocks the intellectual world. The Swedish Academy announces that Jean-Paul Sartre has won the Nobel Prize in Literature, one of the most prestigious recognitions a writer can receive. And Sartre refuses. He sends a polite but firm letter saying he can't accept the prize because it would compromise his independence as an intellectual, because he doesn't want to be institutionalized, doesn't want to be transformed into an official figure, into a monument. He says he's always refused honors and distinctions, that he didn't accept the Legion of Honor in 1945, nor a chair at the Collège de France, and that accepting the Nobel would be betraying his principles. The refusal scandalizes many people. Some think it's arrogance, others that it's a profound political gesture, but for Sartre, it's simply consistency. He wrote his whole life about authenticity, about not letting yourself be captured by social roles, about maintaining your freedom, and accepting the Nobel would be exactly the type of bad faith he always criticized. It would be saying, yes, I accept being transformed into a recognized authority, into someone the establishment approves of. And Sartre doesn't want establishment approval. He wants freedom to criticize, to question, to change his mind, to make mistakes without having to carry the weight of being a Nobel laureate. But Sartre's life isn't made only of heroic coherence. There are contradictions, failures, errors that he himself recognizes over the years. His relationship with Soviet communism is problematic and full of back and forth. For years, he was too complacent with Stalin's crimes, refusing to openly criticize the Soviet Union for fear of playing into the hands of Western capitalists. For fear of betraying the revolutionary cause, he visited the USSR several times, wrote laudatory texts that today sound like naivety or intellectual cowardice. And only after the invasion of Hungary in 1956 does he finally publicly break with the French Communist Party and begin to criticize Stalinism more openly. This failure, this voluntary blindness before Soviet oppression, is one of the most serious stains on Sartre's biography, and shows how even the philosopher of freedom can fall into his own traps of bad faith when political engagement clouds critical judgment. Sartre is also accused of contradictions between his personal life and his philosophy. While preaching equality and freedom, his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, however revolutionary it was, had asymmetries of power, and there are reports of how he emotionally manipulated some of his lovers, how his freedoms often worked better for him than for the women around him. He himself recognized in his last years of life, in conversations with Beauvoir that were published posthumously, that perhaps he hadn't lived his philosophy as perfectly as he would have liked, that there was a distance between the ideal of authenticity he preached and the confused and imperfect reality of his concrete existence. In the 1970s, Sartre is getting old, nearly blind, his body fragile after decades smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, drinking alarming quantities of amphetamines and alcohol, living in a self-destructive way that eventually takes its toll. But he doesn't stop. He continues writing, dictating texts when he can no longer see the pages, continues getting involved in political causes, supports the student movements of May 1968, participates in protests against the Vietnam War, sells Maoist newspapers on the streets to challenge censorship. His last great work is a monumental and unfinished study of Gustave Flaubert, the family idiot, where he tries to apply his existential Marxist method to understand how Flaubert became Flaubert, how the child born into a bourgeois family in Rouangi transformed into the writer who wrote Madame Bovary. It's a work of thousands of pages, obsessed with details, trying to capture the totality of a life and a project of being, and it remains unfinished. A monument to Sartre's intellectual ambition and his refusal to simplify the complexity of human existence. In 1980, in April, Jean-Paul Sartre dies of pulmonary edema at 74 years old at Brisset Hospital in Paris. More than 50,000 people attend his funeral, a crowd that follows the coffin through the streets of Paris. And among them is Simone de Beauvoir, the necessary love of his life, who would die 6 years later and be buried beside him. But here's the question that remains and brings us back to the beginning of this journey. What can Sartre's philosophy tell us today, in the 21st century, about how to become who we really are? Because we live in a world that, in many ways, is even more alienating than Sartre's world. We live in an age of social media where the gaze of the other has multiplied infinitely, where each person has become simultaneously observer and observed, where we construct carefully edited versions of ourselves for public consumption and completely lose ourselves in the difference between who we are and who we pretend to be. We live in a self-help and optimization culture where we're bombarded with contradictory messages. Be yourself, but be the best version of yourself. Be authentic, but make sure your authenticity is profitable and pleasing to others. We live in a capitalist system that reduces us to consumers, that sells us ready-made identities, that transforms even rebellion into merchandise, that captures every gesture of authenticity and transforms it into content to sell. And amid all this, it's easy to forget what Sartre tried to teach us, that you're not your biographers, not your resume, not your bank account, not your followers, not what your parents wanted you to be, not what society expects of you. You're a project, an open process, a freedom condemned to choose every second whom you want to be. Becoming who you really are in Sartrean philosophy isn't discovering a hidden essence inside you, isn't taking personality tests until you find your true nature, isn't following your passion as if it were a predetermined destiny. It's taking on the terrifying and liberating responsibility that there's nothing inside you waiting to be discovered. You are what you do. You create your essence through your choices, your acts, the way you respond to the situations you're thrown into. And this means you can, at any moment, choose differently. You can today start living in a way that's more true to what you value, what you believe, what you choose as your project of being. It's not easy. Sartre never said it would be easy. The existential anguish that comes with awareness of absolute freedom is real and can be paralyzing. When you realize you're totally responsible for your life, that you can't blame your parents, your childhood, your zodiac sign, your personality, your circumstances, it's frightening. When you realize you're, every second, choosing who you are and could choose differently, it's vertiginous. And the temptation of bad faith is enormous. It's so much more comfortable to say you are this way because you were born this way, that you can't change because this is your nature, that your circumstances don't allow it. But Sartre rips these excuses from our hands. He forces us to look at the brutal fact that we're always choosing, always free, always responsible. And perhaps Sartre's most important legacy isn't in the technical details of being and nothingness, isn't in the complex ontological categories, but in this simple and devastating message: you can't hide. You can't outsource your life. You can't pretend someone or something will decide for you. Even when you submit, you're choosing to submit. Even when you obey, you're choosing to obey. And this means you have power. You have the capacity to change, not in a magical way where you simply wish and everything transforms, but in a concrete way where you start acting differently, choosing differently, building a different life through small decisions that accumulate and create a new trajectory. Sartre lived this. He refused to follow the conventional path of a respectable philosophy professor. He rejected marriage, official honors, comfortable bourgeois life. He wrote novels and plays in addition to philosophy because he believed philosophy couldn't stay confined to academia. He engaged politically even when it was dangerous and unpopular. He made mistakes, had contradictions, but never stopped trying to live with authenticity, to take responsibility for his choices, to exercise his freedom to the end. And that's what he's asking of you. Not to be perfect, not to have a life without contradictions, but to wake up, to stop sleeping, to look honestly at your life and ask, are these choices mine? Or am I living on autopilot, repeating patterns I learnt, following expectations I never questioned, hiding behind excuses that protect me from the anguish of freedom? And if the answer is, you're living someone else's life, if you recognize you're in bad faith, the good news is, you can change now. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, not when you have more courage or more resources, now. Because you're free. And this freedom is the only thing no one can take from you. Not circumstances, not the people around you, not your past. You are, at this exact second, choosing. And you can choose differently. Sartre doesn't give us a manual on how to live. He doesn't offer 5 steps to authenticity or 10 habits of existentially fulfilled people. What he offers is something much more valuable and much more difficult. He returns our responsibility to us. He tells us that life is ours, that the project is ours, that the choices are ours, and that we can't wait for someone to come save us, give us purpose, tell us who we should be. We have to do this alone. And yes, it's lonely. Yes, it's anguishing. But it's also the only way to live with dignity, with authenticity, with the feeling that you're really alive and not just being lived by external forces. Becoming who you really are isn't discovering a true self. It's creating that self day after day, choice after choice, assuming the radical freedom and radical responsibility that comes with it. It's saying, yes, this is my life, these are my choices, and I take total responsibility for them. It's frightening, but it's the only way to be free. And in the end, as Sartre lived and taught until his last day, freedom is all we have. It's our burden and our greatness. It's our condemnation and our salvation. If you made it this far, it's because something inside you is seeking answers that the world around you can't give. This restlessness you feel, this sensation that there's something more authentic waiting for you. It's not weakness. It's the first sign that you're ready for a real transformation. This channel exists exactly for people like you, who don't settle for shallow answers and who have the courage to look inside, even when it hurts. Here, every week, I bring new videos exploring the philosophers who can illuminate this path you're walking, always with the same depth and care you saw here. It's not about accumulating empty knowledge, it's about finding real tools to live with more freedom, authenticity, and purpose. Subscribing to the channel is a small act, but it can be the beginning of a journey that will completely change how you see yourself and your choices. And you don't have to do this alone. There's an entire community here in the comments, people who feel what you feel, who fight the same fights. Click that subscribe button, activate the bell, and let's go together in this search for a life truly worth living. You deserve this clarity. You deserve this freedom.